my idea of freedom is a moral idea of freedom. I think of freedom as something that is connected to moral responsibility, and it's in the awareness of moral duty that we really are, that we become free. And in that sense, freedom is distinguished from the ideological appropriations of freedom that we are familiar with, that we have seen throughout history, and that political institutions try to persuade us. And it's a moral ideal, and it's a moral ideal that guides the critique of society and of the societies in which we live. I think of it as an internal moral ideal, but that also gives us ground for criticizing society. And it's something that requires moral social relations to be realized externally. So there is an internal component that has to do with this moment of moral responsibility that requires us to construct a world of moral social relations. And that is the ideal of society that comes out of this internal dimension of freedom. I don't think capitalism really has an idea of freedom, actually. I think it's more a sense of no constraints. And so in capitalist societies, the notion that guides interactions is that the spontaneous, uncoordinated pursuit of every individual's happiness will at some point deliver, through some miracle intervention of the market, greater freedom for everyone. But to me, that is more like a dogma in a way. It's like a credo that it's not necessarily borne out in the historical reality of capitalist societies. It's something that starts, it's rooted in these 17th, 18th century theories of the the private vices that become public virtues. So this idea that everyone pursues their own notion of the good and every individual pursues their own happiness. And if we just let every individual pursue their own happiness, then hopefully something greater will result for everyone. But as I say, I think that is a promise that's not necessarily realized. I think it's grounded in an economic model of interactions that requires people to see each other as tools for the advancement of the happiness of one person. So I think the sense of the ideal of freedom, if we can speak of an ideal of freedom that underpins it, is one where there are no constraints on the individual in terms of how much the individual can impose, how many burdens they can impose on other people. And the economic structure of capitalism is such that you have huge asymmetries of wealth and power, and that enable the advancement of a few people, but at the expense of others, of the majority, actually, of people. So I think this is why it's an obstacle to freedom, because unlike in my conception of freedom, which is a moral ideal of moral social relations, where individuals relate to each other as in this Kantian tradition as ends in themselves, in this capitalist model, individuals are not ends for each other, they are tools for the advancement of someone, of their own individual ends. I don't think we have a fully fledged ideal of what that future society that would realize this moral conception of freedom would look like. And I also don't think we should have it, because I believe that that ideal needs to be constructed, and it needs to be constructed from social criticism. So what we need is many instances of challenges of the political institutions that we have, and we need robust social critique that comes from many corners, that comes from social movements, from politicians, from intellectuals, from artists. And we need to have the discourses in motion that can enable us to search for this ideal. But I don't think there is a set of rules, and I don't think there's an individual that has those sets of rules that can guide others in the realization of this society. I believe, I personally, in my work, I have written a lot about democracy, and I think that opening up, sort of radicalizing democratic institutions, so opening up political representation at all levels, is an important step. I also think that egalitarian social reforms and egalitarian economic reforms are very important. So distributing more widely ownership structures in this more egalitarian direction is really important. But as I say, this is a combination of sources for social criticism rather than a fully fledged account of what the world would look like that realizes this ideal of freedom. it's more important to start with a criticism of what we have and to be really radical in that criticism and hope that that will set in motion social practices that go in the direction of the construction of this social ideal. The moral social ideal of freedom is in many ways inspired by the work of Kant. And in particular, there is different responses to Kant's thought. One common criticism is that Kant's conception of duties is very formalistic and very abstract, and I am quite critical of that way of reading and that particular interpretation of Kant. On the other hand, there is another common, I think, misperception, which is to say that Kant's morality is for the individual, when in fact it has much more to say about the human being as a whole. It's something that's much more capacious than individuals. When you talk about the human being, you're not talking about just existing living individuals. You're talking about generations, both past generations and future generations. And I find Kant's system particularly interesting to reflect on this idea of the human being that is at the center of this moral universe and that needs to think about transforming society in reflection of this moral relational idea of freedom. I'm very interested in in 20th century philosophy. I've been very interested in critical theory of the Frankfurt School kind, and so in the thought of Adorno, Horkheimer, Habermas, and the later, more recent generations of the Frankfurt School. That's one trend of thought that I have been really inspired. I'm inspired also by John Rawls and his critique of theory of justice and his critique of distribution in liberal capitalist societies, even though I think there is much more radical potential there than Rawls himself accepted. I'm interested in traditional Marxist critiques of capitalism that scrutinize the economic structure and that reflect on the failures of globalization. I've been very interested in the development theories of Giovanni Arrighi, for example, or Immanuel Wallerstein, and so theories that reflect on the asymmetries of power in the north and the south of the world, and this look at the international political order. I'm really interested in critical legal theory, and so how international law and international institutions reflect the power structures and power asymmetries that shape capitalism. And so I think my thought is constructed from a variety of these sources, and it's in conversation with all these different schools of thought. I think of socialism as a radicalization of liberal ideas, and so a set of theories that starts from a critique of liberalism as not being sufficiently adequate to realize freedom for everyone, not just at this formal abstract representational level and within particular states for the whole world. And I think of it also as a theory that contains some important elements of critique of contemporary capitalist institutions. So in that sense, I think it has really the two elements that are important, at least in theory. When we talk about socialism as a set of historical experiences, it's something very different, because I don't think that the socialist societies that we have observed and that we have lived under in the 20th century actually were very democratic. It was quite the opposite. In fact, I think that was one of their major failures, was the fact that they were not sufficiently democratic, and that they, instead of dispersing power, they concentrated it, and instead of challenging bureaucracy, they entrenched it. So it depends a little bit on what we mean by socialism, and if we think of it as a system of ideas or as historical practice. And the difficulties of reflecting on the future of socialism is exactly the difficulty of navigating this theory that is both a set of ideals and also a set of historical existing political institutions. I think the left has in some ways lost its connection to the Enlightenment and to the universalist emancipatory project that marked the Enlightenment. One of the, as I see it, misfortunes or difficulties of the contemporary left is that it has radicalized a kind of critique of the Enlightenment that is damaging for the left itself. I think of the classical left and classical socialist thought as emerging from this remainder of criticism in the Enlightenment as in some ways an effort to radicalize the message of the Enlightenment and to say that these Enlightenment political institutions and the ideas that inspired the Enlightenment tradition were actually not sufficiently realized in the liberal capitalist societies of the 18th and 19th century. The left has lost that connection to this universal message of the Enlightenment and finds itself at a difficulty, at a crossroad in terms of being able to articulate all these different discourses that come from very different corners of society and grievances of social groups that are seem on the surface completely disconnected from each other. And I think the difficulty with the identity critique is that it's in some ways gives people a cause. So it gives people a way to care about marginalized, oppressed groups and to stand for their rights and to stand for their inclusion and their representation. But on the other hand, it lacks a discourse that can put together all these different grievances that come from very different corners, from very different groups, in one coherent discourse that transforms society for everyone and with some universal ideal. And so I think the dialectic of the universal and the particular has gone too far in the direction of catering for the particular, but with the risk and with the flaw that it's unable to then accommodate all these different particulars in one integrated discourse. And that is very unfortunate in a situation where we face global struggles and global challenges, and we need to think about the unit of concern as the world rather than all these different particular identities. I worry that human rights in contemporary discourse have become just labels that we appropriate without really having sufficient ways of institutionalizing them and realizing them. And so we talk a lot about rights without talking about the responsibilities that we have for realizing those rights, and without talking about duties, and without talking about the kinds of agents that can be responsible. So I'm on the one hand, it's very important. I find human rights discourse really empowering, in particular in contexts where agents' needs claim against collective institutions, against the state, or against groups that oppress them and marginalize them. On the other hand, I find that if we only limit the conversation on rights without thinking about duties and responsibilities, then it risks becoming tokenistic and just a kind of box-ticking exercise that is very interesting for discourse, but I don't think will really lead ultimately to fundamental social change in the world. I think of the European Union as having a very limited and in many ways cynical idea of freedom. Europe is the European Union. I think there's a distinction between Europe as a whole, as a concept, and as an idea and as an ideal, and the set of European Union institutions that we often refer to as Europe, even though the one is much more narrow than the other. European Union institutions, I think, need to be. The project is very important, and I believe in that project very strongly, because I think it's very important at this stage to have a project of transnational integration that tries to bring together a mechanism of coordination of common challenges. On the other hand, the European Union suffers from, and has always suffered from, a severe democratic deficit, which makes it really unresponsive and unaccountable to its citizens. It also suffers from the original sin of its commitment to a neoliberal project that shapes European Union institutions and isn't really fit for purpose and isn't really fit for the challenges of the 21st century. So when we think about reforming the European Union, I think we need to think about a reform that goes both in the direction of democratizing its institutions and opening up its fundamental economic structures to an egalitarian, social-oriented project.